broadcast. It's April 12th, 2018, and it's good to be back. We just spent a few days this week hosting a conference in Salt Lake City, our Forum for Innovative Treatment Solutions conference, and relevant to this particular broadcast, we had somebody from, in fact, the president of the Joseph Campbell Foundation, who presented to us about the overall theme of the conference, which was shame in the context of our myths and our culture and in our personal lives. So it was a wonderful event. It's an event that we're committed to. It's part of our core values of providing opportunities for professionals to do their own work, to look at themselves in the process. It's our belief that professionals that do their own work, that are committed to sitting on the other couch, that they're better prepared to be able to serve their families and the children that they work with. So that's what we're fresh off of. And I'm excited to be back with this particular broadcast because it's one of my most enjoyable topics, this idea of the hero's journey. First and foremost, I want to recommend to you, and some of you, I'm sure I know, have watched this video. If you haven't, I can't recommend something more with more strength than watching this video. Watching Finding Joe, a film by Patrick Solomon. It really is an accessible way to understand what the hero's journey is. Joseph Campbell, the philosopher of the 20th century, who studied all of the world's myths. And what he did was he deciphered a kind of common pattern. You can think of it as an algorithm, where he saw that all of the great myths and stories and cultures across the earth and across all time followed a simple pattern, a very common pattern. And he called this pattern the hero's journey. Most importantly, I'll start off by saying the idea of the hero. We think of often of a hero as somebody who goes out and does world famous kind of things. But Joseph Campbell understood it much more simply. He understood it as somebody who met the challenges that life had before them. And this is really where I take the title from my book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, from. This idea that you don't have to do something extraordinary in some ways. Although I think doing your own work is extraordinary, is heroic in this process. So it's this idea of meeting life's challenges and really understanding all the things that we have to go through to develop the best version of ourselves. There's a quote here on the cover of the DVD jacket that I'll share with you from Joseph Campbell. It says, "We must be willing to get rid of the life we have planned so as to have the life that is waiting for us." We must be willing to get rid of the life we plan so as to have the life that is waiting for us. This idea that we go through life with expectations about what it should be, right? And what we find in our process, what our parents find, is when we can let go of the shoulds in our lives, that we can embrace what is. And when we learn to embrace what is, then we also have access to all the lessons and wisdom that it has to offer us. I say very often in my work with families that someday you may very well find that you're grateful for the circumstances, the issues, the situations that brought you to Evoke. And I often hear from families, from parents, months or years later, that when I first said that to them, they were perhaps at least annoyed by me, if not angry with me in the process, thought I was crazy in some way. But it really is our experience. So for those of you that are new listening to this broadcast, I want to offer that same idea, that really the call into this kind of work is an invitation to a new sensibility, a sense of enlightenment, a sense of awareness, that if we went through life and it was smooth sailing, we would not be required, we would not be asked to develop some of the insights and tools and skills that we have. A book that we commonly use, we actually use this book, this metaphor, this motif at our intensives, at our Finding You. It's also something we use with clients. It's a very easy read, and it's a very classic hero's journey, is The Knight in Rusty Armor. If you want to read more about it, you can order it on Amazon, or you can listen to the podcast where I talk about the 9 Rusty Armor, and the sequel, written by Dr. J. McGill, The Letters of Juliet to the 9 Rusty Armor. And the 9 Rusty Armor is about a knight who ends up wearing his armor so much of the time that he can't take it off. And then it's suggested that he go on a journey into the forest to find Merlin. And there, when he finds Merlin, he's set forth on the path of truth, and he goes through certain challenges and castles in his journey toward enlightenment, the discovery of self. So it's a fantastic read, The 9 Rusty Armor by Robert Fisher, if you want to see one very classic hero's journey. So thinking about it in terms of our children's journey, there's a quote by Joseph Campbell that I really like. This is, "I don't believe people are looking for the meaning of life as much as they are looking for the experience of being alive." And I think for a lot of our children, that's in some ways what they're looking for. They're looking for this experience about what it means to be alive. Sometimes the pain that they're trying to escape through their various medicators, it's so overwhelming to them that they run away from that. They run away from that idea of being alive. The invitation at Evoke, the invitation in therapy, is to be alive, to be present with all of your pain, to be present with all of your joy. In fact, the idea that you can't necessarily have the joy without the pain. So therapy is an invitation to life. Therapy is an invitation to feeling the richness of life, even the pain of it. A very common idea that Joseph Campbell put forward was this idea of bliss. He says, follow your bliss, and the universe will open doors where there were only walls. There's a misunderstanding of the word bliss. He chose this word very specifically. Bliss is not hedonism. It's not pleasure-seeking or fun necessarily. Bliss is something much more profound. It's beyond all of that. It's something that we feel in the deepest part of ourselves that gives us our greatest joy. It's the thing that when we do, we feel most connected to others, to the universe, to our higher power. Hedonism, is what we do to avoid the call to adventure, right? Self-medicators like drugs and alcohol, sex, gaming, lying, gambling, putting on a show, creating the false self. Hedonism is what we do to avoid the call to adventure. We self-medicate to block out the angst we feel as we refuse the call. You'll recognize this in a lot of the great stories. It's not just the myths in all of our cultures, but think of the classic movies. Oftentimes, the hero or heroine, it's not necessarily distinguished by gender, the hero initially refuses the call, is reluctant to listen to it. And sometimes what that means is that we have to be shoved into it, right? Someone once described that this bliss, this idea of bliss, is the thing that we cannot not do. And so my idea is that's why at Evoke, we have become so successful at inviting parents to do their work, because you're really following after your children, right? The thing that you cannot not do is love your children. And because they're struggling, because they're in pain, because they've fallen into some deep hole, you're willing to go after them. And so when a therapist like me, or a therapist at Evoke says to you, read this book, write this letter, walk into this meeting, watch this webinar, listen to this podcast, you're willing to do it where otherwise you might not be. And then once you go through the process that I'm going to describe throughout the broadcast tonight. This is a common image, an adaptation of an image that I created. For those of you that are watching, you can see it clear. For those of you that aren't, I would just encourage you to Google the hero's journey and look up any image of it. It's a cycle. We go through it in some ways throughout our entire life, and in some ways we go through it over and over again in our life. And there are three main aspects of the heroic journey. The first is the separation, right? You're going through life, things are going smooth. All of a sudden, your child turns 13, starts to develop depression and anxiety, and you're separated, right? There's separation from the way that life was. You end up in a psychiatric hospital, right, with a suicidal child. You're going through life, everything's going smoothly, and your young adult child is kicked out of college because they're failing, they've been lying to you, they have a drug problem, whatever it is. And so you're pulled out of or pushed out of this kind of status quo. And initially it's very frightening. You know, Joseph Campbell would teach often that if we listen very closely, that the call to adventure comes in a whisper. But the more reluctant we are to listen to what life is asking of us, the more at times dramatic the circumstances are that push us into this. And you can think about that yourself as a parent. So many parents, when they write the hopes and intentions letter, or when they fill out the application, will describe and say things like, I saw all of this, right? Or I didn't see all of this, and I was shocked by it. So you can look at your own journey and see how sensitive you were to the invitations to think about things differently, to get help, to get out, you know, way outside of your box, the comfort zone. So there's this separation. And then when there's a separation, you end up with therapists, mentors, self-help groups, other people. You get into that arena in life, and you have these helpers. And then there's this second stage, which is this initiation, right? Initiation into a new way of thinking, a new way of being. I often describe it as a different kind of sensibility. In many ways, that's really what my broadcasts are about for parents. It's this invitation to think about things differently. When I say to a parent, someday you may consider this a blessing, this experience that you would never prescribe to anybody else. You may consider this a blessing. I'm encouraging people to think about it differently, to adopt a new way of thinking. And for those of you who have been through this for a while, you will know and you will attest to the fact that the difference in the way you think now, the difference in the way that you see the world and see children and see relationships and see communication is so profoundly and fundamentally different than it used to be, that the friends that you used to find so much common ground on, you find yourself more distant from them. And the people that have gone through this process know something that people who don't go through this process know. So again, I won't go through all the stages, but there's all of these experiences and metaphors, that these stories, these heroic journeys. Think about Superman. Think about Rocky. You know, think about all of those kinds of stories. Whatever myth, religion you can imagine, there's similar processes, similar kinds of experiences that are described. So you go through these processes. And lastly, you're asked to fight the dragon. Joseph Campbell says, on the dragon that we fight, there are scales on it. On each of the scales, it says, thou shalt or thou shalt not, right? All the cultural and societal ideas about what we should and shouldn't think, who we should and shouldn't be, our own family of origin, right? That's why so many of you have really come into conflict with your family, the family you grew up in. I know I'm looking at the list of attendees that are attending live right now, and I know some of you have had this experience where your family thinks that you're crazy, your family thinks that you're doing it wrong. And this is the dragon. But in one way of thinking, the dragon is just within you, right? It's your own limitations. It's your own acceptance that what somebody else said was true when it's not true. Not necessarily at all. Somebody said one time in my work with them that when I realized that one of the closely held beliefs that I had throughout my whole life, when I questioned it and when it crumbled, Everything was up for grabs. And that can be very frightening. I had one person tell me after describing the hero's journey and watching the movie that I described, Finding Joe, at the beginning of this broadcast, they said, I can't even get to the dragon battle because my family is telling me not to do it. They're discouraging me to do it. And my response was, that is the dragon battle. That's the thing that's trying to keep you back from the journey. But when you face your fears, face your doubt, face your shame, in some ways, one way of thinking of it is when you come to peace, when you make peace with your dragon, when you learn to love your dragon, when you adopt and integrate all the parts of yourself. That's really what therapy is in my way of thinking. It's not going to a place to listen to somebody say hard things. It's going to a place and learning to say hard things and expose yourself at the risk of receiving the same kind of reaction that you got from your family of origin or the culture that you grew up in. And if you're lucky enough to find an empathic, adequate therapist, adequate container, a safe space, you learn to integrate all those parts of yourself. And then what does the dragon do? The dragon then hands you a gift, hands you the treasure, hands you the wisdom that dragon was hoarding. And then, when you get to that place, when you've done this battle, you come back to the community, you come back to others, and you tell your story. King Arthur's knights went into the forest where there was no path. Because if there was a path there, it was somebody else's path. They went to this dark, scary forest, had these great adventures, and then they came back to the round table to share their stories and their adventures. Doesn't that sound a lot like group? Doesn't that sound like a lot like a parent workshop, a parent support group, an Al-Anon meeting, an AA meeting? You come back and you share your wisdom. You have an elixir of healing to offer to the community, some kind of wisdom, some kind of experience. You have your story. That's really what they do in support groups, is you tell your story. You share your experience, strength, and hope, so other people can see that journey, can hear it, and learn to identify with it. And it's very important you close that loop and share it with the community. So let's first talk about the separation, the call to adventure. The call to adventure is the point in a person's life when they are first given notice that everything is going to change, whether they know it or not. Right? If we're listening very closely, it's a whisper. If not, it's a heart attack. It's a crisis. It's a frightening event. Right? Even though once that dramatic event happens and we wake up, we can look back and identify all the signs that led up to it. We find a way not to listen. Oftentimes the hero refuses the call. Often when the hero is called, they initially refuse the invitation. Right? We don't want to do it differently. We're comfortable with the status quo. It's too painful and too frightening to think about or doing it differently. This idea of aid, supernatural aid, that often happens in storytelling. Once the hero has committed to the quest, consciously or unconsciously, his or her guide and the magical helper appears or becomes known. It's that idea that we know about in our lives, right? When the student is ready, the teacher appears. And then think about it in terms of a therapist, a sponsor, a friend. How many of you have been on either side of the equation when you've shared your struggle and somebody else has the same kind of struggle? I know so many people who have had the courage to be open about the struggle that they and their family have gone through, and what they find is people come out of the woodwork sharing their struggle and their story, asking for help. The crossing of the first threshold This is one of the points along the journey. This is the point where the person actually crosses into the field of adventure, leaving the known limits of his or her world and venturing into the unknown and dangerous realm where the rules and limits are not known. Because George Lucas based Star Wars on Joseph Campbell's model that he gleaned from the book The Hero with a Thousand Faces, you can see very clearly this pattern in Star Wars, how Luke was reluctant initially when the call came, right? Through the little android with the little video hologram. But then, coming back from being away, he came back and his uncle and aunt were dead and everything was ruined. And he had very little choice, almost no choice, but to join Obi-Wan Kenobi into this unknown place. Initiation. In initiation, we go through the road of trials. This is a series of tasks, tests, or ordeals that the person must undergo to begin the transformation. Often the person fails one or more of these tests, which often occur in threes. Right? We don't get it right away. We try over and over again. Think about the things that you're asked to do, the letters that you're asked to write, the skills that you're asked to adopt. Think about storytelling. Oftentimes, the hero of the story, the protagonist of the story, stumbles and makes mistakes. It takes a while for them to grow. Think about Luke Skywalker in the original Star Wars and how it was difficult for him, and he kept wanting to go back to his previous sensibility. And the meeting with the goddess. The meeting with the goddess represents the point in the adventure when the person experiences a love that has the power and significance of the all-powerful, all-encompassing, unconditional love that a fortunate infant may experience with his or her mother. The person begins to see him or herself in a non-dualistic way. This is a very important step in the process and is often represented by the person finding the other person that he or she loves most completely. This is not necessarily a romantic experience, but rather somebody who finds you. So many people as I cross other people's stories, will talk about the one person in their story that saw them, that offered compassion, that offered a hand, that offered non-judgmental service to them. You know, in my life, I can identify my 6th grade teacher, Mr. McKechnie, as the first one in my life that I had this experience with. I can think of my uncle, who came into my life when my father wasn't there and offered this to me. And most recently in my life, I can think of my wife and my therapist as this kind of serving this kind of role in my life. I've had people tell me that the therapists at Evoke, myself, others, have served this role in their life also. So we get to be on both sides of the equation when we're on this journey. And then the return. The dragon battle precedes the return. You have to slay your dragon, or another way to look at it, you have to love and make peace with your dragon. The hero moves beyond the pairs of opposites to a state of divine knowledge, love, compassion, and bliss. The person is in heaven and beyond all strife. A more mundane way of looking at this step is that it is a period of rest, peace, and fulfillment before the hero begins the return. Right? The use of metaphor in storytelling, and that's something that Campbell talks about, that many of us are metaphorically challenged. You know, one of the things that critics of Campbell railed against often was when he was talking about myths, and he was describing the metaphor of them, he was saying that the stories that are in our myths, the Catholic myth, right, the Christian myth, the Jewish myth, the Islamic myth, the Hindu myth, the Buddhist myth, that these myths aren't literal stories, but rather they're kind of this archetype, this pattern that we can all identify with. You know, when you walk out of a movie and you feel like $1 million after a great hero's journey movie, that's because it's that hero inside of you that is being called. I remember when I was a little kid walking out of Star Wars and The Empire Strikes Back, or Superman, or Rocky, or Top Gun. I remember thinking I was them. And that's what these things serve, is they serve to help us identify that part of us that can do all of this stuff. So in our own journeys, in our personal journeys, we come to this place of enlightenment and peace. The ultimate boon is the achievement of the goal of the quest. It is what the person went on the journey to get. All the previous steps serve to prepare and purify the person for this step, since in many myths, the boon is something transcendent, like the elixir of life itself, or the plant that supplies immortality, or the Holy Grail. It's the thing that we sought after that we didn't know that we sought after. You know, one of the things that Camel talks about is when we go looking for something. But it's more than that. It's different than that. We go into the forest looking for the Holy Grail, but what we really find is a new version of ourselves. We go into the evoke parent education process, thinking that if we follow it, if we go into it, that we'll get the necessary skills and tools to save our child. And what we end up doing is saving ourselves. And that's similar to what I talk about all the time with both clients and therapists that I train and supervise. What we think we want when we enter therapy is not what we end up getting. One great master therapist says, the false self brings the real self into therapy, right? We go in to solve a problem, to work out a marital conflict, and we come out of it with something entirely different. My therapy today is so fundamentally different than what I thought I was going in for 20 years ago. And in ways that I can't describe, it's so much larger and more transcendent. One of the oldest works of literature that we have access to is the epic story of Gilgamesh. I talk about this at the end of my book. Gilgamesh becomes distressed at the death of his friend Enkidu. And because of this distress, he goes to seek out the planet of immortality and goes on a great adventure. Right? How similar does that sound to be the parent of a child at a book? Somebody that he loves dearly is suffering and struggling. So they go to look for the elixir that's going to save that person. And he ends up swimming to the bottom of the sea and finds the plant of immortality and takes it, swims to the surface and sets it while he dries off, while he cleans himself. And while he's otherwise occupied, the serpent comes along and steals the plant of immortality, and it's forever lost. But Gilgamesh returns home with his story, with his journey, to share with everybody what he learned. How similar is that to what you've gone through? And think about the great heroes' journeys that you've seen in literature and movies. The hero often doesn't get the widget. They don't get the thing that they came for. Similar to the way that I just described therapy. Similar to what so many parents talk about when they get into this work. But you have something so much more powerful and transcendent. And it's hard because you come back with it. And the people that haven't journeyed yet say, I don't want that. I'm not looking for serenity. I'm looking for what's going to fix my child. And so the only way we can express that to them is by our story, by telling our story. There's this idea, and you may have heard this in Chinese, this idea that there's this separation in the word opportunity. Excuse me, that crisis, is the combination of two characters, danger and opportunity, right? That absolutely the grief, the fear, the anxiety that you experience in the context of your child struggling is real. And in that is an opportunity to do something different, to be something different, to be in the world in relationship to yourself your child, and others in a different way. Campbell said opportunities to find powers within ourselves come when life seems most challenging. It really is a powerful philosophy of hope. And while he speaks to, draws upon stories and myths from all cultures and all time, he does this to show us that it's the common human experience, everyday experience. So what do we take away from the hero's journey in our lives? Is this idea that we're all on our own journey. I've heard so many critics of Campbell's model because, again, they look at the literalness of what we think of when we think of the word hero. The heroic aspect of the journey is the courage it is to try something different, to consider the unknown, to walk into an Al-Anon meeting, to walk into an AA meeting, to walk into a therapist's office, to show up in the field in a group where a bunch of 16 and 17-year-olds or 18 and 23-year-olds are sitting there, and to share your story. That's the heroic aspect of the journey. Your children and your troubles are the call. At least that's what I would propose. Right? Their struggles, that's the call to adventure. You may be reluctant to answer the call. I hear things like, this is all psychobabble. Or, just fix the kid. I don't have the problem. Just fix them and send them back. I'm doing well in my life. I don't have the symptoms. Look at my life. It's successful. In Campbell's way of thinking, that's the reluctance to answer the call. You have to enter the forest as the knights of King Arthur did, each following his own path. It's going to be lonely and scary and dark. In storytelling, the dark cave, the dark forest, the deep sea, the swamp, right, the wasteland, all of those things can represent what we fear the most. And really what they're talking about is this. Often when I sign my book, when people ask me to sign it, I'll say something along the line of, no matter what the story, the heroic journey is always inward. The motif of death, I think, is important in storytelling, as Campbell illustrates. Something in us must die in order for part of us to emerge, right? We let the image of the hero die, and I'm using hero in a different context, right? Of the good son, the good husband, the good wife, the good daughter. And what can come out of that is a self. There's a title of a book that a friend gave me at a critical, dark time in my life called Death of a Hero, Birth of a Soul. And it speaks to this idea. You'll meet helpers along the way. I hope that's what we can be. I hope the people we introduce you to, the authors, right? The speakers, the philosophers, I hope they can be your heroes in the process. And then you can become a master of two worlds, right? You can come back and you can talk to your neighbors. And then you can walk into a therapy session or an Al-Anon meeting and be the master of the spiritual world, the spiritual part of yourself. And what you'll find in the end is your own story. You'll find a more developed, more enlightened, more awakened self. It won't be painless. It won't be without waves or challenges or trials. But you'll experience some kind of peace and serenity as you continue to travel. And then the last thing to do to close the loop is to share your story. To come back with the elixir that you found and tell others your story. You don't tell them their truth. You don't tell them what to do. That's the old way of thinking, right? Of knowing somebody else's truth and telling them what to do. But you just share with them what you found on your journey. And in that telling and in that listening, they find hope. They find passage. All right, I'm happy to deal with any live questions. First question, I see families with perfect, for the most part, lives. It sometimes feels a bit of a stretch to feel superior to the bland in these families and rejoice in the struggles of our own family. Hard to not think that it is our mistakes that we find ourselves on the journey. You know, there's not a sense of superiority. There's a sense of greater peace. And you know, there's sayings in Al-Anon like, you know, we compare our behind the scenes footage with somebody else's highlight reel, right? We compare our insides to other people's outsides. I will tell you, having been in this work for 23 years, I don't envy those bland families, because when I sit with them at a dinner party or at a picnic and I hear the way they talk to each other, I hear the way they talk to their children, I hear the way they talk about their children. In a million years, I would never want to spend time in that family, in that kind of sensibility, and the suffocating feelings that come from that lack of awareness, that way that I used to be. So it's not it's a sense of humility, not superiority, that comes. It's a sense of empathy and compassion. And for me, it's very easy to see in those families that where there are no waves, no crises, and it's bland, it's easy to see how it's almost like everything is in black and white. And I couldn't live in that family. I remember years ago, I was sitting at an IHOP with my kids, one of the treats that they like. And we were sitting at an IHOP, and I was listening to a father talk to his what looked like a 12-year-old daughter in ways that I think a lot of people would find relatively typical. And I was thinking, if I was that daughter, I would be so angry, so miserable. It was so shaming. So those are my thoughts. All right, I'll go to upcoming events, and then any other questions come in, I'll take them at the end. We would like you all to go into the forest. So what that means is we ask everybody that comes to a vote to go to 6 12-step support groups. Just try 6. Al-Anon, CODA, or Families Anonymous. If you want to go to NAMI.org, you can also find free classes and resources there, or affordable ones. On social media, you can follow us. You can listen to all of these. Please share. The podcasts are free for anybody on your iPhone or iOS device. Go to the podcast app. Android devices, download the SoundCloud app. And on your computer, you can go to soundcloud.com. And in all cases, search Evoke Therapy Programs and subscribe there. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Evoke Therapy. On Facebook, you can search Evoke Therapy Programs. All of those social media platforms have announcements, inspirational stories, connections to other resources. You can find the Evoke Family Foundation on Facebook, and there you can become involved with an organization that helps people that can't afford therapy. New content each week goes up on our blog, the Evoke Therapy blog. You can find that through our website. If you want to read my book, buy a copy of it, you can go to Amazon right now. Go to the paperback option there. You see, if you're looking at the slide, the paperback option, and look at the alternative options right now. It's out of stock in the warehouse. And buy it from Evoke Therapy Programs there. If you want to do your own deep dive into the work, and interestingly, this conference that I just told you about that we hosted for professionals called FITS Conference, Forum for Innovative Treatment Solutions, every single professional was invited to, and most did participate in their own mini experiential that is similar to the ones that we offer for families. So the next Finding You is May 2nd through 5th, and then you can see the schedule there. Go to our website for more information. We do private family intensives that are customized. If you are a professional listening to this broadcast, you can also attend one of our professional growth workshops. The next women's one is May 20th through 22nd. The men's group is closed, is full. So the next opening is in June 10th through 12th. And if you want more information on any of our intensive programs, you can email intensives@evoketherapy.com or go to our website. Upcoming parent support groups. I'll be in New York City on April 23rd. We'll have one of our therapists in Seattle on Saturday, May 12th. And then we're looking to host one in Denver and in the Bay Area coming up. And then email Andrea@evoketherapy.com for more information, or to RCP. We ask all parents that can possibly go to one workshop while they're with us. The next one is April 21st and 22nd at Entrada. This is a multifamily, 2-day workshop, experiential psychoeducation. You can combine that with a visit to your child if your Evoke therapist says that the timing is correct. Contact Gail at evoketherapy.com for more information. Our pursuits trips are for young adults or families. Think therapy life, fly fishing, mountain climbing, canyoneering, camping, anywhere in the world, service projects. I'm happy to take any live questions that are left before I close. The journey is lonely, one parent says. We have lost easily half of our friends. How do we fill the social void? Oh, I wish I had that answer. It's hard to find your people. You know, there's a phrase that's commonly shared where the path is narrow. And so finding your people is sometimes at these kinds of support groups, right? It's at the 12-step groups. But I agree with you, it's lonely. My therapist always says to me, you know, who was Joseph Campbell just shooting the breeze with? Who could he connect to? So I don't have a great answer. And I don't think that as you travel this heroic journey that the candidates, the friends, your people become more plentiful. I think they become more rare. So it's hard and we have to look. You know, one of the things that I think about often in my own hero's journey, my own lonely parts of my journey, is I think about the people that I read, the people that I listen to, the other professionals. I had a friend share with me this week, and I won't give a lot of details, but after our conference, he just said to me, and I could almost tear up telling you, he said, I just feel better when I'm in the same building as you. And I feel the same way about him. And so that's an example of people that we find. And my therapist and my wife are the two people that are my people that I spend the most time around. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for your questions. The next broadcast will be Tuesday, April 17th at 7 p.m. Mountain Time. I'm going to go over the language of letting go. It's a daily reader. One of my favorites. I'm going to use some ones that I've used previously and some new ones to discuss and talk about how a practice of a daily reader, a daily meditation, can help us along on our journey. I hope this is helpful. And remember, for those of you who might have joined late, I would strongly encourage you to follow this up by watching the film by Patrick Solomon entitled Finding Joe. You can get it on Amazon. You can rent it for $3 or buy it for a few more than that. So good luck. Thank you for joining us. Have a great weekend, and I'll talk to you next Tuesday. Take care.